Wait, what are you doing?
I didn't resist. I didn't resist.
Let go of him right now.
At 9:17 a.m. on Saturday, Riverside Drive in Fairmont Heights was so quiet you could hear the wind rustling through the oak and maple trees, the birds chirping in the power lines, and the gentle rolling of tires on the clean asphalt. This was the kind of neighborhood where bad news was generally believed to be unlikely, as everything was neat, bright, orderly, and peaceful, like a picture in an advertisement for the American suburban dream. A dark Mercedes sedan turned onto the driveway of number 14 and stopped at its usual spot. The door opened, and Marcus Thompson stepped out first, wearing a gray hoodie, sweatpants, and running shoes. In his hand was a small canvas bag from the coffee shop a few blocks away, containing 2 cups of coffee and some breakfast pastries. Lisa Thompson stepped out shortly after, as casual as any wife returning from a morning walk, phone in hand, about to check messages, her demeanor calm, like someone who had lived in a safe place. Long enough to believe that calmness was her right. They had just walked around the neighborhood for nearly an hour, a habit they had maintained for 8 years since moving into this house. They greeted a few neighbors, stopped at a cafe for coffee, chatted a little, and then went home. No rush, no secrecy, no tension. Marcus held the house keys in his hand, preparing to open the door. Lisa glanced at the coffee bag, as if considering whether to eat the pastry first or drink the coffee first. Inside the living room, the 2 children heard the car and ran to the window. Marcus Jr., 13, was old enough to understand that things could change color in a second. Angela, 10, still habitually pressed her face against the glass when she saw her parents return, her curious and innocent eyes looking out at the driveway, as if at a familiar scene of her family. If you only looked at the security camera mounted on the porch, you'd think it was just an ordinary morning. But there's one thing the camera didn't capture, and that's what determines the whole story: the prejudice in the mind of the person driving the patrol car. At the end of the street, a police car turned onto Riverside Drive, moving slowly, as if observing. Behind the wheel was Officer Derek Patterson, 12 years in the force, long enough to be accustomed to the feeling of power, long enough to believe his intuition was always right, and long enough to understand that in many cases, he could act first and then try to explain later. Patterson saw the Mercedes in the driveway, saw a black couple in sportswear, saw the bag of coffee, and in an instant, his brain didn't process the scene as 2 residents returning home after a walk, but as a situation requiring investigation. No calls from the dispatch center, no burglary reports, no shouting, no broken doors, no signs of crime. Just a quiet morning and a look that already contained a conclusion. The patrol car braked sharply and pulled diagonally across the Thompson driveway, not intended to stop the car, but to block the road, sending a clear message that the entrance to the house had just been controlled by a stranger using metal, badges, and a gun. Bodycam switched on. The microphones captured the heavy, rapid breathing, as if Patterson were entering a dangerous situation. The crunching of shoes on the gravel, the hurried footsteps that caused the frame to shake slightly with each step. Patterson's right hand hovered near the holster, a gesture enough to send chills down anyone's spine, for it suggested this could go far beyond words. Marcus turned around, surprised, but not panicked. He raised his hands slightly, palms open, an instinctive reflex of someone who understands that sometimes the best way to survive is to not give anyone a reason to say you're threatening. Lisa stood close to her husband, her gaze shifting quickly from Patterson's face to the patrol car blocking the driveway, like a doctor spotting a dangerous complication before the patient realizes it. Patterson didn't greet her, didn't apologize for the disturbance, didn't say, "I need to verify," didn't position himself as a public servant. His first words rang out as an accusation. "Afternoon. I saw you getting out of that car." Marcus replied calmly, his voice even and clear. "Yes, we just got home." And then Patterson said the next thing, the words that instantly changed the atmosphere. "That vehicle doesn't match people like you." It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. It stated that there was a standard for the right person, and Marcus and Lisa didn't fit that standard. Lisa asked directly, trying to keep her voice steady because she understood how quickly the emotions of the person opposite her could trigger violence. "What do you mean?" This is our house. Marcus spoke slowly, formally, as if he were accustomed to using words to maintain order. We are standing on our property. What's the problem, officer? Patterson took another step, closing the distance, and instead of answering, he chose the easiest path of wrongful power, giving an order. I don't need a crime. Hands against the car. In that moment, Marcus understood that this was no longer a quick check, but a confrontation in which the law was replaced by the I have the right feeling of the gunman. Lisa tried to offer the obvious as a fragile lifeline. We have the bill in our bag. You can see the coffee bag. Patterson interrupted. Ma'am, I'll ask the questions. Both of you, hands where I can see them. Inside the living room, Marcus Jr. pulled the curtains a little further, and Angela clung to the window frame. The children didn't fully understand what was happening, but they sensed what the adults were always trying to hide, the fear spreading through their home like thin smoke. Marcus took a deep breath, and for a brief moment, he considered something few outsiders understood. In moments like these, you might be perfectly legal, but you could still be physically harmed, because the law isn't between you and the gun, only the actions of the person holding it. He didn't want his wife to be dragged down. He didn't want his children to witness bloodshed on the driveway. He had to both reduce the risk of violence and create a trace so that no one could distort the truth later. Marcus looked directly into the body cam, his voice calm but firm, as if speaking before an invisible courtroom. Officer, for the record, this is my home. We have committed no crime. Why are you detaining us? It was a simple question a proper police officer should answer. But Derek Patterson wasn't here to answer. He was here to impose. And that very first decision, the decision to trust prejudice instead of the obvious truth before his eyes, slid everything off. The line of legitimate inspection onto a dark slope, where just one more step would turn a family into an incident, a driveway into a crime scene, and an officer would sign his own door to a fate. He could never have imagined stepping out of his patrol car on this seemingly peaceful morning. Marcus Thompson stood motionless on the hood of the Mercedes, his hands still clasped, his eyes fixed on the flashing body camera in front of Officer Derek Patterson's chest. In that brief moment, one truth was clear, one that only Marcus fully understood. If this went one step further, it would no longer be a misunderstanding, but violence. And violence, once it begins, doesn't care who you are, what you've done for society, or how law-abiding you've been your whole life. Marcus Thompson is no stranger to power. Born in 1970 in Detroit, he grew up in a family where the concept of justice wasn't an abstract slogan, but a daily routine. His mother, Patricia Thompson, was a public defender for over 30 years, dedicating her life to defending defendants already convicted by society before the courts even opened. His father, James Thompson, was a public school history teacher, teaching children about the Constitution, civil rights, and the state's responsibility to its citizens, even in the most underprivileged classrooms. Marcus grew up at dinners where conversations revolved around the right to a fair trial, the right to protection from abuse of power, and the true meaning of the state's monopoly on the use of force. That foundation led Marcus down the path of law. He attended the University of Michigan on a full scholarship, graduating with honors, and was then accepted into Harvard Law School. There, Marcus was not only a top student, but also distinguished himself for his discipline and principles. He graduated at the top of his class, became the editor of the Harvard Law Review, and later worked as a clerk for a federal judge, where he learned how every word in a ruling could change people's destinies and shape the behavior of the entire system. Marcus then joined the Department of Justice as a federal prosecutor. For 7 years, he pursued cases that many feared: public corruption, civil rights violations, and especially police abuse of power. Marcus became famous in legal circles for a simple yet dangerous principle against wrongdoers. He did not compromise. He did not cut corners. He did not accept shady deals merely to close the case. For Marcus, if the law said an act was wrong, then no matter who the perpetrator was, what uniform they wore, or how much power they held, they had to be held accountable. Therefore, at the age of 37, Marcus Thompson was nominated as a federal judge and confirmed by the Senate with rare bipartisan consensus. During his 22 years on the judge's bench, he built a reputation as a tough but fair judge. He handed down harsh sentences to violent criminals, but was willing to dismiss prosecutions if the rights of the accused were violated. He sent 15 corrupt police officers to prison, not out of animosity, but because the law demanded it. To the criminal underworld, his name was synonymous with no escape. To many abusive police officers, his name was a haunting specter. But all of that, degrees, titles, institutional power, was non-existent in Derek Patterson's mind at that moment. Patterson wasn't facing a federal judge, nor the man who had ended the careers of many corrupt police officers. He was simply a black man standing in front of a large house, in a neighborhood he believed didn't belong. Lisa Thompson sensed the change in atmosphere. As an emergency room doctor, she was accustomed to moments when one wrong decision could send everything spiraling into disaster. She watched Patterson's posture, his distance, the way his hand was closer to his holster than necessary, and she understood this wasn't a matter of logic or reason anymore. This was about control. She spoke, trying to keep her voice even, neither challenging nor trembling. "Officer, we just got home. Can you explain why you stopped us?" Patterson offered no explanation. He didn't need one. For him, power allowed him to bypass that step. "ID now?" The command was short, sharp, leaving no room for dialogue. Marcus responded with the question any lawyer or judge would ask in this situation. What is the legal basis for that claim? We are on our property. For an officer who understands and respects the law, this is a moment to stop, to reconsider, to lower their voice. But for Derek Patterson, the question wasn't a legitimate request, it was a challenge. And in a us versus them mindset, a challenge to authority must be immediately silenced. "Turn around," Patterson said, his voice slightly higher and firmer. "Hands on the car. Both of you." Inside the house, Marcus Jr. and Angela watched their parents begin to follow the police officer's orders. They didn't understand the law, the concepts of probable cause or reasonable suspicion. They only understood that their parents were being treated like criminals right outside their door. Marcus Jr. felt something strange, something heavy, something he hadn't felt before, in his chest, a feeling of powerlessness. Marcus Thompson took a deep breath. He knew he was being held illegally. He knew he could cite a host of precedents to prove Patterson wrong. But he also knew that citing precedents now wouldn't protect his wife and children from the risk of being pushed over, handcuffed, or worse. So Marcus chose the path he had. Advised so many defendants in his courtroom. Comply to survive, but take note of everything so that justice could come later. He walked slowly toward the car, each movement deliberate, so that no one could say he was opposing. And as he did so, he spoke clearly, loud enough for the body camera to record every word. "For the record, I am Marcus Thompson. This is my home. We have committed no crime. I am complying under protest." It wasn't just a statement. It was a line. A legal marker laid right in his driveway. And Derek Patterson, in the blind confidence of someone accustomed to going unpunished, was about to cross that line, a step that would turn a baseless inspection into a federal crime, and this peaceful morning into the beginning of his own irreversible downfall. The moment the words, "I am complying under protest," ended, Derek Patterson stepped forward, faster and more forcefully than necessary, as if those very calm words had struck a chord with him. For Patterson, this was no longer a casual encounter. It had become a power struggle he could not afford to lose. He grabbed Marcus Thompson's wrist and twisted it forcefully behind his back, a familiar restraining move but executed with excessive force, without any justification for the threat. Marcus flinched slightly in pain, but didn't cry out. He knew any sound at this moment could be misinterpreted. The bodycam shook violently as Patterson pulled him closer to the Mercedes, the officer's heavy breathing drowning out the sound of the wind. In the neighborhood, Lisa Thompson screamed instinctively, like a wife witnessing her husband being attacked. The coffee bag slipped from her hands, 2 cups spilling onto the driveway. The dark liquid spreading among the pebbles, bread and pastries rolling around like a small but haunting scene of normalcy crushed. "What are you doing?" "Stop," she yelled, her voice breaking with fear and rage. But Derek Patterson didn't stop. He thrust Marcus forward and slammed his body against the hood of the car. The metal made a dull click as Marcus's weight pressed down, hard enough to leave a small dent, hard enough that no one could tell whether it was a gentle or necessary contact. Marcus felt his breath being squeezed out of his chest, a sharp pain shooting from his wrist to his shoulder. But his voice, though pressed against the cold metal, retained a terrifying control. "Officer," he said, each word slow, directed straight at the bodycam recording. "Everything. You are assaulting me without probable cause. This encounter is being recorded." It wasn't a plea. It was a record. A judge reading a record for the very person breaking the law. From the porch, the security camera captured the entire scene from a wider, colder, and more objective angle. It clearly showed Marcus not resisting, not turning, and not engaging in any behavior that could be considered threatening. It showed Lisa standing a few steps away, her hands raised unconsciously, her face pale with fear. And it revealed a detail that would later captivate the jury. In the living room window, two children were looking out. 13-year-old Marcus Jr. was old enough to understand that what was happening was wrong. He saw his father being pinned down in a car, like a dangerous criminal, right in front of his house, and he understood that his father had done nothing wrong. A mixture of indignation and fear made his hands tremble. Angela didn't understand the law, didn't understand civil rights. She only understood one thing. A man in uniform, carrying a gun, was hurting her father. She pressed her small hands against the window, her mouth open, and screamed, "Daddy!" The scream pierced through the glass, so clearly that both the body camera and the security camera captured it. Lisa Thompson struggled to hold back tears, forcing herself to act. As an emergency room doctor, she had learned to push fear aside to do what needed to be done. She saw the situation spiraling out of control with each passing second. She knew that if Patterson continued in this agitated state, her husband could be more seriously injured. She spoke loudly, her voice trembling but clear, trying to break through the frenzy of power. "Check his jacket pocket. Please. His papers are in there. He's a federal judge." For a brief moment, Derek Patterson paused, not out of remorse, but out of curiosity. He still held Marcus down on the hood, but his head tilted slightly toward Lisa. "Don't talk nonsense," he growled, as if it were a trick to get away with it. But the seed of suspicion had been sown. Patterson thrust his other hand into Marcus's jacket pocket, a gesture both rough and disrespectful, as if searching an unknown suspect. Marcus didn't resist. He knew that in just a few seconds, everything would take a completely different turn. He simply continued speaking, his voice maintaining a chilling calm. "You are committing a federal crime. Badge number visible. Officer Derek Patterson." His correct pronunciation of Patterson's name wasn't accidental. It showed he was alert, remembering, and preparing. Patterson pulled his hand out of his jacket pocket and held a leather wallet. He opened it, initially with the irritated expression of someone annoyed. But then his eyes stopped. The bodycam captured that moment. The words United States District Court, the gold seal, the hard card with the photo and name. Marcus Thompson. Time seemed to freeze in the quiet driveway. Patterson's hand began to tremble uncontrollably. His breathing became rapid. His face turned pale, as if all the blood in his body had drained away at once. "Oh, God," Patterson whispered, his voice so low it was almost inaudible. He released Marcus's wrist and took two clumsy, uncontrolled steps back. Marcus slowly straightened, adjusting his posture, his wrist bright red and his shoulder aching, but his gaze remained sharp and calm. He turned to face Patterson, not with anger, not with fear, but with the familiar air of someone who still sat on the higher platform in the courtroom. "This stop was unlawful," Marcus said. "This detention was unlawful. And what you just did was assault." He looked directly at Patterson, each word seemingly nailed to the air. "You will provide your badge number, your supervisor's name, and your internal affairs contact. This encounter has been recorded from multiple angles." Derek Patterson stood frozen in the Thompson family's driveway, his mind reeling from the disaster he had just created. He had attacked an innocent man right outside his home, in front of his wife and children, and now realized that man was a federal judge. But what terrified Patterson most wasn't just the title on his card. It was the fact that every action he took, every word, every gesture, every unwarranted escalation had been recorded. And there was no turning back. Derek Patterson stood motionless in the driveway, his leather wallet still clutched in his hand like a burning object he couldn't hold on to, but also dared not let go of. The body cam continued recording, its red light flashing steadily like an invisible countdown. In Patterson's mind, every familiar scenario for handling the situation crumbled at once. There was no way to rewrite this story. No report could distort what the camera had just captured. He hadn't just stopped the wrong person. He had crossed a line that federal law considers a crime. Marcus Thompson took a deep breath, trying to steady his breathing to lessen the pain radiating from his wrist to his shoulder. He looked directly at Patterson, his voice low and controlled, carrying an authority that didn't need to be shouted. "Officer Patterson," he said, reading the name as if it were a written record. "Do you understand that you have just committed federal crimes?" The question didn't need an answer. It was posed to mark the moment when power shifted, where the gunman was no longer in control. Patterson opened his mouth, then closed it. Sweat began to bead on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Judge, I didn't know," he stammered. "I didn't realize. Dispatch said there was a suspicious person's call. I was just responding." The excuse came out as a survival reflex, but it was weak and clumsy, like a deflated lifebuoy thrown into the middle of the ocean. Marcus didn't need to raise his voice. He just shook his head slightly. "There was no call," he said emphatically. "You initiated this stop on your own, and now you're attempting to fabricate a justification after the fact. That, too, is on camera." He tilted his head slightly towards the body cam on Patterson's chest, then towards the security camera mounted on the porch. "Everything is documented." Lisa Thompson stood close to her husband. She placed her hand on Marcus's uninjured arm, both to reassure him and to keep herself from trembling. When she spoke, her voice no longer tried to be gentle. It carried fear, anger, and the responsibility of a mother. "My children just witnessed you attacking their father," she said, each word heavy with emotion. "One is 13, and the other is 10. Do you understand what you just did to them?" As if those words had opened the final door, the front door swung open. Marcus Jr. rushed out onto the driveway, tears still streaming down his face. He ran straight to his father and hugged him tightly. "Dad, are you okay?" he asked urgently, his voice trembling. Then, as if remembering something most important, he turned to Patterson and said, both fearfully and resolutely, "I filmed it. I got everything." In his hand was his phone, the screen still lit. That statement struck Derek Patterson harder than any accusation. 3 recordings, 3 camera angles, 3 layers of truth. He looked at the phone in Marcus Jr.'s hand, as if another prison door had slammed shut. I need to call my supervisor." Patterson mumbled, his voice devoid of any authority. "Yes," Marcus Thompson replied immediately, without hesitation. "You do that. And while you're at it, I'll be calling the FBI." He turned to Lisa, nodded slightly, then pulled out his phone with his other hand. Assaulting a federal judge and depriving citizens of their rights under the law are federal crimes. This is no longer a matter for your department to handle internally. Patterson took another step back, almost tripping over the driveway. In his mind, the years gone by flashed like a fast-forwarded film. Unwarranted traffic stops, ignored complaints, and purely ceremonial, supplementary training. He used to believe that at worst it would just be an internal meeting, a warning, a piece of paper to sign. But this time was different. This time, the person standing before him wasn't some anonymous citizen who could be silenced. Just minutes later, the radio crackled, a sergeant's voice answering Patterson. But the voice didn't have that familiar sense of security. It sounded hurried, tense, and hesitant when he heard the name Marcus Thompson. "Stay where you are," the voice on the radio commanded. "Do not leave the scene." Marcus stood in his driveway, one hand on his son's shoulder, the other holding his phone, feeling the pain but maintaining an astonishing composure. He knew that from this moment on, the story was beyond Derek Patterson's control. It wouldn't be buried. It wouldn't be settled with an internal memo. It would go straight into the system Marcus had spent his life operating and overseeing. And as Patterson stood there, waiting for his superiors to arrive, waiting for his fate to be decided, a cold truth began to seep into him. The prejudiced decision he had made in those fleeting seconds that morning had triggered an irreversible chain of events. A chain that would take away not only his badge, but also his freedom, his honor, and years of his life. Too high a price for a morning that should have been just another ordinary morning. Less than 20 minutes later, Riverside Drive was no longer the quiet weekend. Morning Street. The sound of cars stopping abruptly, doors opening abruptly, and hurried footsteps echoed on the road, usually only filled with the sounds of birds and children's bicycles. First another patrol car, then another. Sergeant William Morrison appeared, his face tense from the moment he stepped out, for he already knew the name of the man standing in the driveway. Morrison didn't need to ask many questions. Just seeing Marcus Thompson, seeing Lisa clutching the two children, seeing the clear dent in the Mercedes hood, and seeing Derek Patterson standing a few steps away looking like he'd just lost the world, he knew this wasn't an ordinary incident. Morrison approached Marcus, his voice low, trying to maintain a professional tone. "Judge Thompson, I'm Sergeant Morrison. I'm sorry about what's happened here." But the apology was belated and weak. Marcus looked at him, his gaze cold and alert. "Sergeant, this officer detained me without cause and assaulted me on my own property. This is all on camera." Morrison turned to Patterson, his gaze no longer that of a colleague, but that of someone who understood a dangerous line had just been crossed. Before any further attempts at appeasement could be made, a dark-colored car without local markings pulled up at the end of the driveway. Two men and a woman stepped out, neatly dressed, their eyes sharp, their movements swift. The FBI. No loud announcements, no fanfare. Their appearance itself carried a message. Authority here had just shifted. An agent walked straight up to Marcus, showing his badge. "Judge Thompson, I'm Special Agent Ramirez, Civil Rights Division." Marcus nodded. "Thank you for coming." His voice was so calm it made those around him feel a lump in their throat. Agent Ramirez turned to Patterson. "Officer, please remove your body camera and hand it to me." Patterson hesitated for a very brief second, then complied. It was a symbolic moment. A local police officer handing over evidence against himself to the federal government, right where he thought he was in complete control. Lisa was invited to sit on the steps in front of the house. Another agent spoke to Marcus Jr., softly but seriously, asking him about the video he had recorded. The boy held out his phone with both hands, as if handing over something very important. Angela clung to her mother, still trembling. All of this unfolded in a heavy silence, the kind of silence that only appears when everyone understands there is no turning back. Agent Ramirez photographed Marcus's wrist, where swelling and discoloration had begun. He photographed the shoulder of his shirt, where the marks were. He photographed the dent in the car's hood. Each click of the camera was like hammering another nail into the door of Derek Patterson's future. Morrison stood to one side, his face tense, trying to speak quietly to a colleague. But his voice faltered. He knew that from this moment on, the Fairmont Heights Police Department no longer controlled the story. After quickly reviewing the bodycam footage and security camera footage, Agent Ramirez turned to face Patterson. His voice was firm, leaving no room for negotiation. "Officer Derek Patterson, you are under arrest for assault on a federal official and deprivation of rights under the color of law." The handcuffs were removed. The sound of metal snapping shut around Patterson's wrists was dry and clear enough for even distant neighbors to hear. Patterson offered no resistance. He stood still, his eyes vacant. In that instant, everything was reversed. The man who had just ordered hands on the car was now the one handcuffed. The man who had just believed he was in control of this space was now being led away from it. As the agents led Patterson toward the federal vehicle, Marcus stood beside his wife and children. One hand on Lisa's shoulder, the other gripping Marcus Jr., he said nothing. There was no need to speak. Justice at this moment lay not in words, but in the action unfolding before their eyes. The federal vehicle rolled away from Riverside Drive, taking Derek Patterson and all the illusions he once held about his invincibility. As the car disappeared from view, Chief Daniel Rodriguez emerged, his face more serious than at any press conference he had ever attended. He stepped forward, taking a deep breath. "Judge Thompson, on behalf of the Fairmont Heights Police Department, I apologize for." Marcus raised his hand to stop him. "Chief Rodriguez," he said, his voice low but sharp, "this didn't happen in a vacuum. That officer has a history, and your department kept him on the street." Rodriguez was silent. He couldn't deny it. He couldn't argue. And Marcus knew that. This incident will not be handled quietly, Marcus continued. There will be a federal investigation. There will be a civil lawsuit. And there will be accountability, not just for him, but for the system that allowed this. Those words weren't a threat. They were a prediction. As the cars began to leave, Riverside Drive gradually returned to its outward tranquility. But nothing remained intact. On the driveway, the coffee stain had dried into a dark patch. On the car hood, the dent was still there. In the eyes of the two children, the image of the man in uniform pinning their father down wouldn't fade as quickly as the cars had gone. And in the legal system that Marcus Thompson understood better than anyone, a large gear had begun to turn, slowly, heavily, but unstoppable, towards something Derek Patterson never thought he would face. A verdict that couldn't be settled internally. Within the first week following the incident, the story at Riverside Drive had transcended the boundaries of a mere personal transgression. The FBI wasn't just investigating Derek Patterson's conduct that Saturday morning. They were delving into a far more dangerous question. Why was someone like Patterson still wearing his uniform? After 12 years in the force, Patterson's internal files arrived at the U.S. Attorney's Office in thick stacks of documents. 8 complaints of excessive force, for allegations of racial discrimination during roadblocks in an affluent neighborhood. Numerous reports from residents and community organizations described the same pattern of behavior: unprovoked roadblocks, provocative rhetoric, threats of obstruction when those stopped questioned, and unnecessary escalation of tension. None resulted in lengthy suspensions. None resulted in demotions. The majority concluded with familiar phrases: insufficient evidence, contradictory testimony, no policy violation determined. FBI agents began calling each person who had filed a complaint. The interviews lasted for hours, and for many, it was the first time they had been seriously listened to. The stories were terrifyingly repetitive. They spoke of being targeted simply because of their skin color, of being asked to prove ownership of their vehicles despite having no traffic violations, of suspicious stares and hands poised at guns, and of how, when they complained, everything vanished into a secretive internal system where uniforms mattered more than the truth. The data collected by the FBI further clarified the picture. Analysis of Patterson's traffic stop. Reports revealed that the rate of stopping and searching black people in affluent neighborhoods was many times higher than that of other officers on the same shift. There was no proportional correlation in crime detection. In other words, prejudice doesn't create safety. It only creates more victims. Patterson's reports of the use of force also showed a pattern: using force in situations with no clear threat, and then justifying it with vague, unsubstantiated language, often repeated from one case to the next. Meanwhile, the Fairmont Heights Police Department's internal affairs division was under scrutiny. Agents discovered that many investigations lasted only a few days, lacked thorough witness interviews, did not review area security camera footage, and almost always prioritized the testimony of the officer being complained against. Some records showed that the investigator and the person under investigation had worked the same shift, received similar performance reviews, and had a personal relationship. The system was designed to protect insiders, not to uncover the truth. As news of the investigation spread, turmoil began to erupt within the police department. Officers who had heard about Patterson but never seen the consequences now realized their protective umbrella had been removed. Mid-level leaders worried, understanding that the question was no longer what did Patterson do, but who knew and turned a blind eye. Every approval signature, every lenient disciplinary decision from the past now became potential evidence. The U.S. Attorney's Office acted swiftly and decisively. In addition to charges of assaulting a federal official and disenfranchising, they added a charge of making false statements to a federal investigator based on Patterson's lie about a suspicious call. Audio recordings from the switchboard were extracted, showing no calls related to Riverside Drive at that time. It wasn't a mistake. It was an attempt to fabricate a story after the event had occurred. Patterson's lawyers, faced with a growing body of evidence, 3 video sources, the Thompson family's testimony, statistical data, complaint history, and evidence of lying, began seeking a plea deal to mitigate the consequences. But federal prosecutors were in no hurry. To them, This case was more than just a sentence for an individual. It was a message that badges are not a shield against the law, and that turning prejudice into violence comes at the cost of freedom. While the legal machinery moved with cold, precise speed, the Thompson family faced a different reality, consequences not visible in the case file. Marcus Jr. began to flinch at the sound of a car siren. Angela clung to her mother when she saw police passing by the school. Lisa, accustomed to the life-or-death pressures of the emergency room, stayed awake many nights, replaying images of her husband being pinned to the hood of a car right outside their door. And Marcus, who had spent his life believing that the system, however slow, would ultimately lead to justice, now understood more deeply than ever the personal price that justice demanded from those who forced it to operate. And in the closed chambers of federal office, as each piece fell into place, a conclusion gradually emerged. The morning at Riverside Drive was not an accident. It was the inevitable result of a system that had tolerated wrongdoing for too long. The upcoming trial would not just try Derek Patterson. It would bring an entire culture of impunity to light, a place where, this time, there was no room to hide. 11 months after that morning on Riverside Drive, the case officially became United States versus Derek Patterson before the federal court. That was long enough for the initial shock to subside, but not long enough for its consequences to fade. For Derek Patterson, it was 11 months of detention awaiting trial. His badge stripped, his name making headlines, and the truth relentlessly pursuing him through every page of the legal documents. For the Thompson family, it was 11 months of therapy, sleepless nights, and a bitter truth. Justice never comes quickly, even when the evidence is overwhelming. The trial was assigned to Judge Patricia Williams, a long-standing and respected judge with no connection to Marcus Thompson. From the outset, this sent a crucial signal. The case would be tried rigorously, transparently, and without privilege, regardless of the victim. The courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, and observers from across the country. The atmosphere was heavy, not because of drama, but because everyone understood that what was about to unfold would set a precedent. The indictment was read aloud, without beating around the bush. Derek Patterson was charged with assaulting a federal official, deprivation of constitutional rights under the guise of the law, and perjury to federal investigators. Each charge included aggravating circumstances, unlawful conduct, occurring on the victim's private property, in the presence of a minor, and fully documented on video. As each charge was read, Patterson sat motionless, his hands clasped together, his gaze fixed on the table, as if simply not looking up would make everything seem less real. Patterson's defense attorney attempted to construct a familiar narrative, an officer reacting instinctively, concerned about safety, and making a misjudgment of the situation. But in the preliminary arguments, federal prosecutors exposed the fatal flaw of that argument. They presented data showing no calls from the switchboard, no suspicious reports, and no suspicious activity before Patterson proactively blocked the driveway. This was not a mistake under pressure, the prosecutor said, his voice cold and firm. This was a choice made in calm conditions, driven by bias, and enforced with violence. The list of witnesses was released, and at that moment, many in the courtroom understood that this case had no way out. Dr. Lisa Thompson would testify. Marcus Jr. would testify. FBI agents would testify. Experts on police procedures would testify. And most importantly, the 3 video clips, bodycam, security camera, and cell phone video, would be shown in their entirety, unedited and unfiltered. In the days leading up to the formal trial, the defense attempted to negotiate a plea agreement to reduce the sentence. However, the federal prosecutor refused. The reason was clearly stated in the response. Given the severity of the conduct, the presence of children, the defendant's prior history, and the need for general deterrence, a plea agreement would not serve the interests of justice. In other words, this case had to be tried publicly, and the verdict had to be delivered by a jury. On the first day of the trial, once the jury had been selected and settled into their seats, the prosecutor stood up to deliver his opening statement. There were no flowery words, no emotional script, just a short, powerful opening sentence. This case is about what happens when a badge becomes a weapon. The courtroom fell silent. Patterson looked up briefly, then down again. The defense attorney countered, trying to emphasize that his client didn't know who the victim was, that there was no personal malice. But that very point became a double-edged sword. The prosecution immediately pressed on. Exactly. He didn't know, and he didn't care. That is the problem. That stark truth hung over the courtroom. If the victim hadn't been a federal judge, what would have happened next? As the trial moved on to the presentation of evidence, the large screen lit up. The first image appeared, the familiar driveway on Riverside Drive, bathed in soft sunlight. Two people preparing to enter their home. No one spoke, because everyone knew that from that moment on, every defense would have to confront something undeniable, the truth being recorded. And Derek Patterson, sitting at the defendant's table, understood perfectly well that from now on, every second of that video would bring him closer to the sentence he himself had triggered on that seemingly ordinary morning. When the first video clip began playing on the large screen in the courtroom, the atmosphere instantly changed. No more rustling papers, no more whispering reporters. Only the familiar images of the Riverside Drive driveway and Derek Patterson's voice, cold and commanding, emanating from the bodycam. The jury saw everything from the perspective of the man holding the gun, the way the patrol car was parked diagonally blocking the entrance, the hurried footsteps advancing, the hand hovering near the holster even though only a couple stood still in front of them. When the words, "That vehicle doesn't match people like you," rang out, a few jurors shifted slightly in their seats. No lengthy explanation was needed. The statement itself carried the full meaning. Then the security camera footage came on. The wide-angle, static, cold shot was like a witness who couldn't lie. It clearly showed Marcus Thompson resisting, making no unusual movements, and showing no signs of threat. It showed Lisa Thompson instinctively raising her hand, taking a half-step back as Patterson approached. And it showed the moment Marcus was forcefully pinned to the car's hood, the metal clearly denting under the pressure. A juror covered their mouth at the dry, sharp sound that echoed in the silent courtroom. The third video was shown last. It was filmed on Marcus Jr.'s phone, from inside the living room, through the glass window. The low, slightly shaky angle conveyed the panic of a child. Angela's cries of "Daddy" rang out, high and broken, piercing through the courtroom. No one on the jury could maintain a neutral expression. Some bowed their heads. Others stared intently at the screen, as if averting their gaze would mean shirking their own responsibility. After the video footage ended, the prosecutor didn't rush to call witnesses. They allowed a few seconds of silence, enough time for the images to sink in. Then they called Dr. Lisa Thompson to the stand. Lisa recounted that morning in the calm voice of a doctor accustomed to facing crises, but every word weighed heavily on her. She spoke of the helplessness of watching her husband being pinned to the car, of the fear that one wrong move could make everything irreversible. She spoke of her children's eyes through the car window, eyes she knew would follow them for life. When the prosecutor asked how she felt when threatened with arrest for obstruction, Lisa paused for a second before replying. "I felt the law had left my driveway at that moment." Marcus Jr. was called to testify next. He stepped up to the stand looking thin and much younger than he appeared in the video. He recounted seeing his father attacked, how his hands were shaking so much he almost dropped his phone while filming. "I just thought," he said, his voice choked, "if I didn't film, nobody would believe my dad." That statement was like a needle piercing the heart of the case. Trust had been eroded to the point where a child had to bear the responsibility of being a witness to protect his own family. FBI agents and police procedure experts testified one after another. They explained, in clear and understandable language, that no standard of modern policing would justify Patterson's behavior. There was no reasonable suspicion, no probable cause, no justification for the use of force. A former police chief with over 30 years of experience stated bluntly to the jury, "What you saw on those videos is not policing. It's domination." It was Marcus Thompson's turn to take the stand. He stood there not as a judge, but as a victim. Yet it was his composure, his precise and emotionless description of each moment, that gave his testimony such weight. He spoke of physical pain, but even more so of the moment he realized that understanding the law wouldn't protect him from violence when the law was disregarded. He spoke of seeing his children through the glass and wondering if it would be the last time they saw him standing. The courtroom fell silent as he concluded with a short statement. No one should have to reveal who they are to be treated as a human being. The defense attempted to counterattack during the questioning, but each question struck a wall of evidence. When they suggested that Patterson acted instinctively, the prosecution countered with data and video showing no pressure or danger. When they tried to emphasize that Patterson didn't know the victim was a judge, the prosecution simply responded, "Exactly." That very fact stifled any remaining arguments. As the trial drew to a close, the jury no longer debated what had happened. The only question remaining was responsibility. And as they left the courtroom to deliberate, Derek Patterson sat silently at the defendant's table, confronting for the first time the full reality. That what he had once considered a small decision during my shift had now become a substantial file, documented, analyzed, and poised to conclude with an unavoidable verdict. The jury left the courtroom in silence, carrying with them the full weight of what they had just witnessed. The doors closed, leaving Derek Patterson sitting alone at the defendant's table, his hands clasped together. His gaze fixed on the wooden tabletop as if time would stop if he didn't look up. But time didn't stop. It only slowed, becoming heavier, each second dragging him toward an inevitable end. 6 hours later, the jury returned. No one laughed. No one whispered. The clerk stood, handing the verdict. When the word guilty was read for the first charge, assaulting a federal official, a heavy wave swept through the courtroom. For the second charge, denial of constitutional rights under the guise of law, guilty, rang out again, clear and decisive. And for the final charge, lying to a federal investigator, the jury did not hesitate. Guilty. There were no cheers, no applause, only the silence of a room that had just witnessed justice being called. Derek Patterson closed his eyes. For a moment, his shoulders slumping as if the entire weight of the badge he once wore had fallen straight into his chest. His lawyer placed his hand on his client's shoulder, but said nothing. No words could change the outcome. Sentencing took place 6 weeks later. The courtroom was again packed. The prosecution sought a high sentence within the federal sentencing guidelines, emphasizing that this was not merely an act of violence, but a betrayal of public trust committed in front of children and followed by lies. The defense sought a lighter sentence, citing Patterson's family, his no prior criminal record, and a momentary lapse in judgment. Judge Patricia Williams listened intently, without interrupting or showing emotion. When it came to her sentencing remarks, she looked straight down the courtroom. "Officer Patterson," she said, her voice even and cold, "you assaulted a man on his own property without cause. You did so in front of his wife and children. You then lied to federal investigators to protect yourself." She paused, letting each word sink into the silence. This was not a momentary lapse. The evidence showed a pattern of abuse, of bias, and of disregard for constitutional rights. She referred to the video, to the child calling for his father, to the history of complaints that had been ignored. She called the issue by its name, not occupational pressure, but the belief that power allows one to override the law. "The badge," she continued, "is not a shield against accountability. It is a responsibility." Then the sentence was read. 18 years in federal prison. No parole, no early release. Followed by 3 years of probation after serving his sentence. His law enforcement privileges were permanently revoked. When the number 18 was announced, Derek Patterson slumped into his chair. He covered his face with his hands, his breathing ragged. As if only now did he fully understand the price of that morning at Riverside Drive. The judicial officers advanced. The handcuffs were fastened, this time slowly, precisely, without violence or humiliation, exactly the way every citizen deserves to be treated. As Patterson was led out of the courtroom, Marcus Thompson stood beside his wife and son, his hand resting lightly on Marcus Jr.'s shoulder. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He didn't show any sign of victory. Because for him, this wasn't a personal victory. It was a grim reminder that justice only comes after the damage has been done, after children have been traumatized, after a family has been violated in their safest haven. And as the courtroom door closed behind Derek Patterson, it didn't just close one chapter in his life. It opened another, a chapter in which an entire system was forced to confront the consequences of its prolonged tolerance of unchecked power. The criminal verdict closes one chapter. But for the Thompson family, it's only half the story. The rest doesn't unfold in the courtroom, but in a different legal space, where the question is no longer who is guilty, but who is responsible for a system that allowed this to happen. Just weeks after the sentencing, Marcus and Lisa Thompson filed a federal civil lawsuit. The lawsuit targeted Derek Patterson not only as an individual, but also directly at the Fairmont Heights Police Department and the city. The allegations were clear and straightforward: violations of the Fourth Amendment for unlawful detention and use of force, violations of the 14th Amendment for discrimination, assault and battery, intentional psychological harm, and most importantly, negligent lack of supervision and training, allowing an officer with a long history of complaints to continue out on the streets with a gun and power. The city attorney reviewed the files and understood one thing immediately. This case was unwinnable. 3 video clips, a federal criminal conviction, statistical data revealing a pattern of discrimination, internal affairs files exposing hanging investigations. If they entered the discovery system, every email, every meeting minutes, every signature approving lenient disciplinary actions in the past would be brought to light. The price wouldn't just be money. It would be reputation, position, and the very political survival of those in power. Negotiations began early, in a tense atmosphere. Thompson's side wasn't just demanding compensation. They were demanding change. Marcus understood that money might help his family heal to some extent, but if the system didn't change, other families would continue to become victims. Finally, an agreement was signed. The compensation was substantial, millions of dollars. But that wasn't the most important part. The crucial element lay in the mandatory reform provisions. The Fairmont Heights Police Department was placed under federal consent decree with an independent supervisor for years. Body cams became mandatory for all officers, and data was stored and monitored independently, not by the department. An early warning system was established, tracking complaints, frequency of use of force, and traffic stop data by race. Any officer exceeding the threshold would face immediate review. Internal affairs has been restructured. Investigations are no longer a matter of insiders handling their own affairs. A civilian oversight board has been established with access to records and the power to request disciplinary action. Training on bias and de-escalation is conducted by independent experts, not just perfunctory training in closed-door meetings. These changes came at a price. Some officers with poor records were forced to resign or be transferred. Several middle managers quietly left their positions. The city faced the anger of the police, union, and political pressure from many sides. But for the first time in years, the community sensed something rare, an acknowledgement that the problem wasn't just one individual. Throughout the process, Marcus Thompson played the most unusual role, both as the plaintiff and as someone who understood the system he was suing. He didn't use the language of emotion. He used the language of structure, of mechanisms, of accountability. Without the safeguards, he said in a hearing, these wrongdoings are not exceptional. They are inevitable consequences. When the agreement was announced, Riverside Drive was quiet again. But that quiet now carried a different meaning. It was no longer a silence of concealment. It was the calm after an earthquake, when the city understood that the price of condoning power had been billed, and this time, no one could pretend they didn't see it. Changes written on paper are meaningless if they don't touch reality, and that's why the impact of the Riverside Drive incident went beyond legal provisions. In just the first year under federal oversight, the numbers began to speak volumes, something political promises often fail to achieve. Stops targeting Black people in affluent neighborhoods plummeted, while stops based on actual traffic violations increased uniformly across all population groups. Reports of forceful use decreased significantly. Most importantly, independent surveys showed that public trust, which had been eroded over the years, showed signs of recovery for the first time. But the most profound impact of the case wasn't in the statistics, but in how it changed perceptions. Video footage from the Thompson driveway was used as training material at police academies across the United States. Every frame was paused, analyzed, and dissected. Why did the officer park his car blocking the driveway? Why was the initial statement accusatory? Why did the escalation occur despite the lack of a threat? And why did the violence only stop when the victim's identity was revealed? These questions were no longer academic. They were connected to the image of a man being pinned down in his car, right in front of his own home. Marcus Thompson turned personal experience into a tool for change. He wrote a legal analysis of how the perspective on policing changes when judges become victims of abuse of power. The article was widely cited in civil rights conferences and judicial training. In his talks to judges and prosecutors, Marcus didn't recount the story to evoke emotion. He used it to remind them that all anti-police cases should be read with healthy skepticism, because power, when left unchecked, tends to protect itself first. The Thompson family also stepped into a role they had never chosen. Marcus Jr., from a boy witnessing violence through a window, became a voice at youth forums about police responsibility. He recounted that morning not to assign blame, but to explain what it felt like when trust was shattered in the safest space. Angela, after years of therapy, found solace in writing. Her poems, about window panes, about screams, about fear, were read at community events and reached people who had never considered the psychological impact of police brutality on children. Lisa Thompson continued her work as an emergency physician, but in an expanded role. She collaborated with medical organizations to develop guidelines for identifying and documenting injuries related to violence by law enforcement. For her, each well-documented medical record is a piece of the puzzle that can help bring justice to fruition somewhere in the future, even if the victim lacks power or a strong voice. In Fairmont Heights, change didn't come smoothly. There was opposition. There was discontent. Some called the reforms over-intervention. But over the years of oversight, the cumulative results have weakened the opposing arguments. Removing officers with dangerous behavioral patterns didn't make the city less safe. It made it safer. Years later, when federal oversight concluded, the final report concluded that the reforms were not merely procedural, but deeply ingrained in policy and culture. It was a rare conclusion, and it persisted for a simple reason. The Riverside Drive incident forced the system to change in the public eye, where any denial became meaningless. But for the Thompson family, the legacy of that morning was never just about reform or numbers. It was the memory they carried with them, the lesson about the fragility of the right to fair treatment. And from that memory, a larger question continued to resonate in law classrooms, police training rooms, and community meetings across the country. If a federal judge could be treated this way, what was happening to those without identity to defend themselves? Years have passed since that morning on Riverside Drive, but the story doesn't end the way one might expect, that things would be all right. Derek Patterson served his full 18 years in federal prison. No early release. No special privileges. When he was released in his 50s, he had no badges, no career, no identity that had once given him power. His marriage was broken. Old friends in the force were silent. The jobs he could find were those that didn't require a clean past and didn't give him any power over others. In a rare interview years later, Patterson said he regretted it, that he only did what he was taught. But those words sounded empty. For what was missing wasn't sorrow for the consequences, but understanding of the cause, the prejudice that had led him to believe he had the right to suspect, order, and use force against innocent people. Marcus Thompson remained a federal judge. He presided over trials with the same composure as before, but one thing had changed forever. When the police testified, when the prosecutor presented the case file, when the defendant was charged with resisting a police officer, Marcus saw more than just legal documents. He saw his driveway. He saw his son's eyes through the window. He saw the moment when the law vanished from what should have been the safest space. That experience didn't make him more bitter, but rather more critical of power and more wary of explanations offered too easily. The Thompson family still lives in that house. They haven't moved. Marcus once said in a brief interview, "If we left, it would be like admitting that fear has the right to drive us from the very lives we've built." The dented car hood was repaired long ago, but memories can't be repaired. They can only be put back in place, as a silent reminder of the price of silence and the need for light. The 3 video clips from that morning, bodycam, security camera, and a 13-year-old's phone continue to be used in police academies, law classes, and civics training sessions. They aren't shown to ridicule an individual, but to illustrate a chain of missteps, from the first glance, to the first words, to unnecessary escalation, and finally, violence. People pause the footage and ask, what should have been done differently? The answer always begins with something very simple: treat the other person as a human being before treating them as a threat. This story ends with a verdict, a reform agreement, and improved numbers. But its true meaning lies in what Marcus Thompson once said, very softly, very slowly, after everything had settled. Justice should not depend on who you are. But the reality is that it often does. His case became proof of both things at once: that the system can function correctly when forced to do so, and that too many people are not in a position to force the system to listen. Therefore, if this story makes you feel outraged, sad, or uneasy, those are not unwarranted emotions. They are the right reactions. Because if a federal judge can be dragged out of his car right in front of his house simply because of his skin color, then the issue isn't with an individual, but with how power is granted without commensurate responsibility. Before the video ends, ask yourself this question: how many stories like this have never been recorded, never been brought to court, never led to reform? And if we stop looking, stop remembering, stop demanding accountability, what will prevent the next peaceful morning from turning into a new tragedy? If you're watching from somewhere in the world, please leave your location in the comments. And if you believe that power is only safe when it's in the light, please subscribe. Because accountability doesn't exist by itself. It only comes alive when someone is willing to look directly at it, tell the story, and not allow stories like this to be buried in silence.